In the heart of Washington, D.C., a giant sits in silence. He is frozen in white Georgia marble, staring out over a nation that, by all rational accounts, should not exist today. We often look back at the American presidency as a management job, a role defined by steering the ship of state, fixing the economy, or passing legislation. But in the 2.5 centuries of the United States, only one man was asked to do the impossible. He wasn't asked to steer the ship. He was asked to stop it from sinking while half the crew was actively trying to burn it down. When Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office on March 4, 1861, the United States was effectively dead. It was a failed state. 7 states had already seceded from the Union. The economy was in freefall. The military was fracturing, with its best officers resigning to fight against the very flag they had sworn to protect. European superpowers were circling like vultures, waiting for the American experiment in democracy to finally collapse so they could carve up the remains and prove that a government of the people was a fool's errand. Historians, scholars, and the general public consistently rank Abraham Lincoln as the greatest president in American history. But we must ask ourselves, why? Is it simply because he won the war? Is it because he freed the slaves? Or is it something deeper, something more fundamental to the human spirit? To understand Lincoln's greatness, we have to strip away the myth of the honest rail splitter and look at the cold, hard reality of the man. We have to look at the strategist who taught himself the art of war when his generals failed him. We have to examine the politician who outmaneuvered the most brilliant and ruthless minds of his era. And perhaps most importantly, we have to understand the man who suffered from a depression so severe that friends once removed razor blades from his room, fearing he would take his own life. This is not just a biography of a politician. This is the story of how a prairie lawyer with less than 1 year of formal education saved the concept of democracy for the entire world. It is a study of resilience, of grand strategy, and of the unique burden of leadership when the world is falling apart. This is the story of Abraham Lincoln, the commander-in-chief who walked into a burning house and refused to let it fall. Part 1. The House Divided. To understand the fire that Lincoln walked into, we must first understand the fuel that had been piling up for decades. By the year 1860, the United States was a geographical contradiction. 2 different nations trapped inside one border, bound together by a constitution that was beginning to tear at the seams. In the North, the Industrial Revolution was exploding. Cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia were becoming global hubs of manufacturing, finance, and railroads. It was a society built on free labor, immigration, and rapid modernization. In the South, society was frozen in a feudal agrarian system, entirely dependent on King Cotton, and the 4 million enslaved human beings whose forced labor made that cotton profitable. For the Southern aristocracy, slavery was not just an economic engine, it was the foundation of their entire social order, a peculiar institution they believed was sanctioned by God and necessary for civilization. For 40 years, American politicians had tried to glue these 2 nations together with compromises. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850 were desperate attempts to balance the power between slave states and free states. But these were just bandages on a cancer. The South feared that as the North grew in population and industrial power, the balance would inevitably shift. They believed that if they lost control of the federal government, they would eventually lose their property, their wealth, and their way of life. Enter the year 1860, the backdrop for the most chaotic and consequential election in American history. The Democratic Party, which had been the only truly national party holding the country together, finally shattered under the pressure. It split into northern and southern factions, unable to agree on the issue of slavery in the territories. This fracture opened the door for a brand new political entity, the Republican Party. The Republicans were a terrifying prospect for the South. Formed just 6 years earlier, they were an explicitly Northern party dedicated to stopping the expansion of slavery into the West. Their nominee was a relatively unknown former congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was a dark horse. He wasn't the first choice of the establishment. Legends like William Seward were far more prominent. But Lincoln possessed a political genius and a clarity of thought that his rivals lacked. 2 years prior, during his failed run for the Senate against Stephen Douglas, Lincoln had delivered a speech that predicted the coming storm with chilling accuracy. He famously declared, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other." The South heard this not as a prediction, but as a threat. They viewed Lincoln not as a moderate who wanted to restrict slavery's growth, but as a radical abolitionist who would incite slave rebellions and destroy their economy. When the results came in on November 6, 1860, the sectional divide was absolute. Lincoln won the presidency with only 40% of the popular vote, carrying the populous North and the West. He did not carry a single Southern state. In 10 Southern states, his name wasn't even on the ballot. It was a victory, but it was a victory that signaled the end of the old Union. The reaction in the Deep South was instantaneous. They did not wait to see what Lincoln would actually do. The mere fact of his election was seen as an intolerable act of aggression by the North. The South Carolina legislature immediately called a convention, and on December 20th, they voted unanimously to dissolve their union with the United States. It was a domino effect. By February 1861, before Lincoln had even packed his bags for Washington, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas had followed suit. They seized federal forts, arsenals, and custom houses. They formed a new government, the Confederate States of America, and elected Jefferson Davis as their president. Lincoln's journey to his inauguration was a humiliation that set the tone for the early days of his presidency. Pinkerton detectives uncovered a credible assassination plot in Baltimore, where a mob was planning to kill the president-elect as he transferred trains. Lincoln was forced to sneak into his own capital city in the dead of night, disguised aboard a secret train car, cutting telegraph lines to prevent the news from leaking. The press mocked him as a coward. The South mocked him as a tyrant. The North wondered if they had elected a weakling who was afraid of his own shadow. On March 4, 1861, Lincoln stood before a half-finished Capitol building. The dome was still under construction, surrounded by scaffolding and cranes, a perfect metaphor for the broken nation he was inheriting. His first inaugural address was a desperate olive branch. He spoke directly to the South, promising not to interfere with slavery where it already existed, trying to reassure them that his administration posed no threat to their rights. He closed with a plea for memory and unity, saying, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." But the time for words had passed. The South wasn't listening to his poetry. They were loading their cannons. Part 2. The Prairie Lawyer and the Melancholy. Who was this man tasked with saving the Republic? If you looked at his resume in 1861, it was laughably thin compared to the giants of the era. He had served one forgettable term in Congress a decade prior. He was a country lawyer who rode the circuit in Illinois. He had lost his bid for the Senate just 2 years earlier. But Lincoln's qualification for the presidency wasn't found in his political victories or his administrative experience. It was found in his personal suffering. The American dream often starts with humble beginnings, but Lincoln's beginnings were brutal. Born in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky, He grew up on the hard frontier of Indiana. It was a life of backbreaking labor, battling the wilderness, and intellectual isolation. He later estimated that he had less than 12 months of formal schooling in his entire life. Everything he knew, law, history, literature, geometry, he taught himself. He would walk miles to borrow a book and read it by the flickering light of the fireplace until his eyes burned. This was the first sign of his genius, an insatiable, relentless drive to improve himself, to transcend the limitations of his birth. But the defining feature of Lincoln's early life was not just poverty, it was death. His mother died when he was 9, killed by milk sickness after drinking milk from a cow that had eaten poisonous snake root. He watched her die in agony. His sister Sarah, who had been a surrogate mother to him, died in childbirth a few years later. His first love, Anne Rutledge, died of typhoid fever when Lincoln was a young man. These tragedies did not just make him sad, they triggered a deep chemical imbalance within Lincoln's psyche. Today, we would diagnose it as severe clinical depression. In the 19th century, it was known as melancholy. But it wasn't just a fleeting sadness. It was a crushing, paralyzing darkness that followed him for his entire life. There were periods where his friends genuinely feared for his safety. During one particularly bad episode in his 30s, famously known as the fatal 1st of January, friends removed razors, knives, and scissors from his room, afraid he would commit suicide. He once wrote to his law partner, "I am now the most miserable man living. If what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family, there would not be one cheerful face on the earth." How does a man survive that level of internal torture and go on to lead a nation? He survived by forging an iron will. He learned to endure. He developed a dark, self-deprecating sense of humor as a defense mechanism, telling jokes and stories to keep the darkness at bay. When accused of being two-faced during a debate, he pointed to his own rugged, homely face and quipped, "If I had another face, do you think I would be wearing this one?" This experience with profound mental anguish is critical to understanding his presidency. The Civil War was a traumatic event for the nation, a collective mental breakdown. It required a leader who understood trauma, a man who had never known suffering, who had lived a charmed life of privilege, would have shattered under the weight of 600,000 dead soldiers. But Lincoln had been living with ghosts his entire life. He had walked through the valley of the shadow of death long before he arrived in Washington. He possessed a capacity for empathy and a tolerance for pain that no other politician could match. Politically, Lincoln was a pragmatist. For most of his life, he was a Whig, a follower of the great compromiser Henry Clay. He believed in infrastructure, banks, modernization, and the rule of law. But his moral compass was set on one issue: slavery. He was not an abolitionist in the radical sense. He didn't initially call for immediate, uncompensated emancipation, and he held some of the racial prejudices typical of his time. But he possessed a moral clarity that cut through the noise. He believed slavery was morally wrong, a cancer that contradicted the promise of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. He believed that if you contained it, stopped it from spreading to the new territories in the West, it would eventually die a natural death. It was this conviction that slavery was a monstrous injustice that must be placed on the path to ultimate extinction that drove him into the arena against the most powerful interests in the country. This was the man who walked into the White House in 1861, not a general, not an aristocrat, but a man of the people, forged in poverty, tempered by depression, and possessing a mind like a steel trap. He was a man who had learned to master his own demons, and now he had to master the demons of a nation. Part 3. The Commander-in-Chief. The waiting ended at 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861. Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter, a Federal outpost in Charleston Harbor. The bombardment lasted for 34 hours. When the American flag was lowered in surrender, the Civil War had begun. Lincoln responded immediately. He used his executive powers to call for 75,000 volunteers to put down the insurrection. He was careful with his language. He never referred to the Confederacy as a nation, but as a rebellion of individuals. However, his call for troops backfired in the Upper South. Viewing this as an act of coercion, 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, seceded and joined the Confederacy. The loss of Virginia was particularly devastating. It was the most industrial southern state and the home of the nation's best military talent. Lincoln was now a wartime president, a role the Constitution defines as commander-in-chief. But he had a massive problem. He knew almost nothing about commanding an army. His only military experience was a brief stint in the Black Hawk War decades earlier, where he jokingly said the only blood he saw was from mosquito bites. The Union's top general was Winfield Scott. A hero of the Mexican-American War, Scott was a brilliant strategist, but was physically incapacitated by age and weight. He was too large to mount a horse and suffered from severe gout. Despite his infirmity, Scott possessed a clear vision. He proposed a long-term strategy known as the Anaconda Plan. The plan was to blockade the southern ports to cut off trade with Europe, control the Mississippi River to slice the Confederacy in two, and slowly strangle the rebellion until it suffocated. It was a sound strategy. In fact, it was exactly how the North eventually won the war. But in 1861, it was politically impossible. The Northern public and the press clamored for a quick, decisive victory. They screamed, "On to Richmond!" They wanted a battle that would crush the rebellion in a single afternoon. Lincoln, bowing to this immense political pressure, ordered an attack. The result was the First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861. It was a catastrophe. The Union Army, green and undisciplined, fought bravely for a few hours, but eventually collapsed in panic. Soldiers threw down their muskets and fled all the way back to Washington, D.C., mixing with the terrified civilians who had ridden out with picnic baskets to watch the show. The defeat at Bull Run was a wake-up call. The illusion of a 90-day war vanished. Lincoln realized this would be a long, bloody, and existential struggle. He also realized something else. He couldn't trust the military establishment to do the thinking for him. So, the Prairie lawyer went back to school. He turned the White House into a war room. He checked out nearly every book on military strategy from the Library of Congress. He studied the campaigns of Napoleon and Frederick the Great. He pored over the works of military theorists like Jomini and Clausewitz. He analyzed maps until his eyes burned. He spent his nights at the War Department telegraph office, reading raw reports from the front lines, often sleeping on a cot while waiting for news. Through this obsessive self-education, Lincoln developed a strategic insight that eventually surpassed his West Point-trained generals. He understood the math of the war better than they did. He realized that the Union had the advantage in numbers, logistics, and industry. He understood that to win, the North had to leverage these advantages by attacking on all fronts simultaneously. If the Union attacked in Virginia, Tennessee, and the Mississippi Valley at the same time, the Confederacy, with its smaller population and limited rail network, would break under the strain. They wouldn't be able to shift troops from one front to reinforce another. But having a strategy is one thing. Finding a general willing to execute it is another. In the wake of Bull Run, Lincoln turned to George B. McClellan to save the Army. Known as the Young Napoleon, McClellan was everything Lincoln was not. He was wealthy, highly educated, arrogant, and charismatic. He did a miraculous job rebuilding the shattered Army of the Potomac, drilling the men, boosting morale, and turning a mob into a disciplined fighting machine. But McClellan had a fatal flaw. He was afraid to fight. McClellan suffered from a psychological delusion that the Confederate Army was always twice as big as it actually was. He sat outside Richmond with a massive, well-equipped army, refusing to attack, constantly demanding more men, more cannons, and more time. He viewed himself as the savior of the country and Lincoln as an incompetent meddler. The relationship between Lincoln and McClellan became the central drama of the first half of the war. McClellan openly despised the president. In letters to his wife, he called Lincoln a well-meaning baboon and a guerrilla. He treated the commander-in-chief with open contempt, once famously going to bed while the president was waiting in his parlor to speak with him. Lincoln, demonstrating incredible patience and a lack of ego, absorbed the insults. He famously said, "I will hold McClellan's horse if he will only bring us success." He knew he needed McClellan's organizational skills, at least for the moment. But he also pushed him, prodded him, and pleaded with him to use the vast army he had built. In the Peninsula Campaign of 1862, McClellan finally moved. He floated his army down the coast and marched toward Richmond. He got within sight of the church spires of the Confederate capital. Victory seemed imminent. But then, the Confederates found a new commander, Robert E. Lee. Lee was a tactical genius, aggressive, audacious, and terrifyingly competent. In a series of battles known as the 7 Days Battles, Lee bluffed and hammered McClellan. Despite having a larger army, McClellan lost his nerve. He retreated, claiming he was overwhelmed by superior numbers, snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. By the summer of 1862, the situation was dire. The North was losing. Morale was collapsing. The public was turning against the war. Lincoln faced a crisis of leadership. He realized that the war could not be won with half measures. He couldn't just fight to preserve the old Union. The old Union was already gone. The war was changing him, hardening him. He began to see that to win, he had to break the South's backbone. He had to strike at the root of their power. He had to stop trying to be a manager and start being a conqueror. The time for the amateur was over. The time for total war was approaching. Part 4. The Moral Pivot, Antietam and Emancipation. By the summer of 1862, Abraham Lincoln was trapped in a strategic paradox. He realized that to win the war, he had to escalate it. He had to strike at the very foundation of the Southern economy and social order: slavery. But he was bound by political chains. The border states, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri, were slave states that had remained loyal to the Union. Lincoln feared that if he moved too fast against slavery, these states would defect to the Confederacy, doubling the South's manpower and resources. He famously remarked, "I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." Furthermore, the international situation was critical. The British and French economies were starving for Southern cotton. Their textile mills were shutting down, and their workers were rioting. The aristocratic governments of Europe were looking for any excuse to recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation and intervene in the war, just as France had intervened in the American Revolution. If the British Navy entered the war to break the Union blockade, the United States was finished. Lincoln needed a masterstroke. He drafted a document that would change the course of human history, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. But when he presented it to his cabinet in July 1862, his Secretary of State, William Seward, gave him crucial advice. Seward warned that issuing the proclamation while the Union Army was losing battle after battle would not look like an act of justice. It would look like our last shriek on the retreat. It would be seen as a desperate attempt to incite a slave insurrection because the North couldn't win on the battlefield. Seward told Lincoln, "Wait for a victory." So, Lincoln put the document in his desk drawer and waited. He waited through a summer of defeats. He waited while Robert E. Lee, sensing the Union's weakness, launched a daring invasion of the North, crossing the Potomac River into Maryland. Lee believed that a victory on Northern soil would shatter Northern morale and bring Britain into the war. The collision happened on September 17, 1862, near a quiet creek called Antietam. It remains, to this day, the bloodiest single day in American history. In 12 hours of combat, there were over 23,000 casualties, 4 times the number of American casualties on D-Day. The fighting was so intense that the cornfield where the battle began was cut down as if by a scythe, not by harvest tools, but by bullets. Tactically, the battle was a draw, but strategically, it was the opening Lincoln needed. Lee's invasion was halted and his army retreated back to Virginia. It wasn't the decisive knockout Lincoln wanted, but it was enough. 5 days later, Lincoln opened his desk drawer. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This document is often misunderstood. It did not free all the slaves in America instantly. It only freed slaves in the territories in rebellion, areas where Lincoln had no physical control. It left slavery untouched in the loyal border states. Critics at the time, and even today, called it a cynical half-measure. But this view misses the genius of Lincoln's strategy. The proclamation was a war measure, justified under his powers as commander-in-chief to seize enemy property. By framing it as a military necessity rather than just a moral crusade, he kept the legal ground firm. More importantly, the proclamation fundamentally changed the purpose of the war. Before 1863, a Union soldier died to preserve a map. After 1863, he died to make men free. By tying the war to the abolition of slavery, Lincoln made it impossible for Britain or France to intervene. The British public, who had abolished slavery decades earlier, would never support a war to defend a slave-holding republic against a liberating army. Lincoln had checkmated the South on the diplomatic chessboard. The proclamation also unleashed a new weapon, the black soldier. For the first time, African Americans were permitted to enlist in the Union Army. Over 180,000 black men, many of them former slaves who had risked their lives to escape, joined the fight. They knew that if they were captured, they would not be treated as prisoners of war. They would be enslaved or executed. Yet they fought with a ferocity that silenced their critics. As Lincoln later noted, without the sable arm of these black regiments, the North could not have won the war. The rail splitter had evolved. He was no longer just a politician trying to hold a coalition together. He had become the great emancipator. But the road to victory was still paved with blood, and the darkest days were yet to come. Part 5. The Darkest Hour, 1864. Despite the moral victory of emancipation and the repelling of Lee at Antietam and later Gettysburg, the war dragged on into 1864. The Union public was exhausted. They were tired of the funeral notices. They were tired of the high taxes. They were tired of the draft. The sentiment in the North was shifting dangerously toward peace at any price. Lincoln faced a new crisis, the election of 1864. No country had ever held a general election in the midst of a civil war. Many urged Lincoln to suspend the election, citing the emergency. He refused. He believed that if the rebellion forced them to suspend democracy, then the rebellion had already conquered the democracy. But to win the election and the war, Lincoln needed a general who could actually destroy the Confederate Army. He found him in a man who had been working in a leather store in Galena, Illinois, just 3 years prior, Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was different from the polished, aristocratic generals Lincoln had fired in the past. Grant was rumpled, quiet, and had a reputation as a drunkard. But Grant understood modern warfare. He understood that the art of war was not about capturing cities. It was about destroying the enemy's capacity to fight. When critics complained about Grant's drinking, Lincoln reportedly replied, "Find out what brand of whiskey he drinks and send a barrel of it to my other generals." In March 1864, Lincoln promoted Grant to lieutenant general, a rank no one had held since George Washington. Together, they devised a brutal modern strategy: total war. Grant would lock on to Robert E. Lee's army in Virginia and never let go, grinding him down day by day. Meanwhile, General William Tecumseh Sherman would march an army deep into the Confederate heartland, destroying their farms, their railroads, and their ability to feed their troops. It was a winning strategy, but the cost was horrific. In May and June of 1864, the Overland Campaign began. It was 6 weeks of continuous, non-stop slaughter: the Battle of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Cold Harbor. In just 1 month, the Union lost nearly 50,000 men, a number roughly equal to Lee's entire army. The Northern press labeled Grant the Butcher. The political fallout landed squarely on Lincoln. As the casualties mounted, his popularity plummeted. The Democrats nominated George McClellan, the very general Lincoln had fired, to run against him. McClellan ran on a peace platform, promising to negotiate with the South to end the war immediately. Everyone knew what that meant: Confederate independence and the continuation of slavery. August 1864 was the lowest point of Lincoln's presidency. He was convinced he would lose. In a moment of profound despair and duty, he wrote a secret note, folded it, and asked his cabinet to sign the back of it without reading the contents. Known as the Blind Memorandum, it read, "This morning, as for some days past, it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be re-elected. Then it will be my duty to so cooperate with the President-elect as to save the union between the election and the inauguration, as he will have secured his election on such ground that he cannot possibly save it afterwards." Lincoln was preparing to surrender his power to a man who would undo his life's work because he respected the will of the people more than his own ambition. But history turned on a dime. On September 2, 1864, a telegram arrived in Washington. General Sherman had captured Atlanta. "Atlanta is ours, and fairly won," Sherman wrote. The fall of Atlanta was the electric shock the North needed. It proved that the war was not a stalemate. It proved that the end was in sight. The public mood swung violently back to Lincoln. In November, he won the election in a landslide, carrying 22 of 25 states and 55% of the popular vote. The mandate was clear. The people had voted to finish the job. The South's last hope, a political defeat of Lincoln, was gone. Now, they faced only the grinding inevitability of Grant and Sherman. Part 6. The Architect of Peace and the Martyr. With his re-election secured, Lincoln's focus shifted. He was no longer just fighting a war, he was building the peace. He knew the Confederacy was crumbling, but he was terrified of what would happen after the guns fell silent. His primary concern was the legal status of emancipation. The Emancipation Proclamation was a wartime executive order. Once the war ended, the courts could potentially strike it down, throwing millions of people back into chains. Lincoln decided he could not leave freedom to chance. He threw his entire political weight behind the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which would outlaw slavery forever. This was Lincoln as the master politician. He used patronage, promises of jobs, and fierce arm-twisting to get the amendment through a reluctant House of Representatives in January 1865. When it passed, the House erupted in cheers. Lincoln, usually reserved, wept. He described the amendment as a king's cure for all the evils. 6 weeks later, on March 4, 1865, Lincoln delivered his second inaugural address. The war was nearly won. The South was in ruins. The North was baying for revenge. They wanted the Confederate leaders hanged. They wanted the South punished. Lincoln gave them something else. In a short speech only 700 words long, he refused to claim that God was only on the side of the North. He suggested that the war was a divine punishment on both North and South for the 250-year sin of slavery. And then he outlined his vision for the future. With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds. It was a plea for mercy. He wanted to bring the rebels back into the fold, not as conquered subjects, but as fellow citizens. On April 9, 1865, the inevitable happened. Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over. Lincoln was in Washington when the news broke. Crowds gathered at the White House demanding a speech. The band asked him what they should play. Lincoln smiled and said, "Play Dixie. It's one of the best tunes I have ever heard. Our adversaries have attempted to appropriate it, but I insisted yesterday that we fairly captured it." It was a final gesture of reconciliation. But Lincoln was a man who had burned his life force to keep the nation alive. Photographs from 1865 show a man who looks 20 years older than the one from 1861. He was gaunt, hollow-eyed, and exhausted. He told his wife, Mary, that he wanted to leave Washington after his term, perhaps travel to Europe, maybe even visit the Holy Land. He wanted to find some peace. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Good Friday, he went to Ford's Theater to see a comedy, Our American Cousin. He wanted to laugh. He sat in the presidential box, holding Mary's hand. During a funny line in the play, while the audience was roaring with laughter, a single gunshot rang out. John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer and famous actor, had slipped into the box and fired a .44 caliber Derringer into the back of the president's head. Lincoln never regained consciousness. He was carried across the street to a boarding house, where he died the next morning at 7:22 a.m. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, the man who had once called Lincoln a gorilla, but had come to love him as a father, stood by the bedside. As Lincoln took his last breath, Stanton whispered the epitaph that would define him forever. Now he belongs to the ages. Part 7. Conclusion. The greatest? The death of Abraham Lincoln was the final tragedy of the Civil War. In a cruel twist of fate, the man who had preached malice toward none was killed by an act of supreme malice. The South, which had celebrated his death, soon realized they had lost their best friend. Without Lincoln's guiding hand, the reconstruction of the South became a bitter, vengeful struggle that lasted for decades. So, we return to the question, why is he the greatest? Is it because he saved the Union? Yes. But a tyrant could have saved the Union by crushing dissent and ruling by decree. Lincoln saved the Union while subjecting himself to a democratic election in the middle of the war. He proved that a government of the people, by the people, for the people, could survive its own internal destruction. Is it because he freed the slaves? Yes. But he did more than sign a paper. He grew. He started the war believing he had no lawful right to touch slavery. He ended it by orchestrating the constitutional amendment that purged the original sin of the American founding. He possessed the rarest quality in a leader, the ability to change his mind when morality demanded it. But perhaps his true greatness lies in his humanity. He was a man of immense contradictions, a pacifist who waged the bloodiest war in history, a man of deep depression who possessed an infinite sense of humor, a politician of great ambition who was willing to lose his job to save his country. Abraham Lincoln was not a statue. He was a man, a flawed, suffering, incredibly complex man. He walked into the fire when the house was falling down. He held the roof up with his bare hands while the flames burned him alive. And when the fire was finally out and the structure was safe, he collapsed in the ashes, leaving us with a nation that was, for the first time, truly free. If George Washington was the father of the country, the man who gave it life, then Abraham Lincoln was the savior of its soul. He showed us that even in our darkest hours, when we are torn apart by hatred and division, there is a way back, but only if we have the courage to listen to, as he called them, the better angels of our nature.